Use of violence. The previous two sections noted the motivations that groups such as the JVP and LTTE had for using violence. In this section, we explore this important topic more generally. On a very basic level, resistance movements use violence to gain concessions by demonstrating a power to hurt the other side, and they threaten or use force to achieve a desirable end state. Indeed, if we pick any asymmetric conflict between a resistance movement and a government, we are likely to see the former use violence against the latter and vice versa to achieve desirable end states. Examples include the use of violence by Hezbollah and Hamas to compel an Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon and the Gaza Strip in 2000 and 2005, respectively, the LTTE's use of violence against the Sri Lankan government to achieve an independent Tamil ethnocracy in northern Sri Lanka, and the Shining Path's violent efforts to remake Peru's economic and political systems along revolutionary communist lines. Often, groups intend to use violence to bring about a change in public opinion to facilitate changes in policy. For instance, C.J.M. Drake, in an article on the role of ideology in terrorist target selection, noted that the Front de Libération Nationale used bombs to attack European civilians in Algeria during its 1954 through 1962 war with France to polarize Europeans from Algerians, thereby making French rule more difficult. Interestingly, Jacana Thomas, in an article on rewarding bad behavior in the American Journal of Political Science, noted that violence can provide benefits even if its use does not culminate in immediate concessions. Violence can also be used to gain a seat at the bargaining table, which in effect may actually kickstart a peace process. Examining monthly data on civil conflicts in Africa from 1989 to 2010, she found that the likelihood that rebels engage in negotiations in the next month when they do not conduct a successful terror attack is 30%. Yet this probability nearly doubles after 10 successful attacks in a month and rises to approximately 88% after 20 successful attacks. Various authors have elaborated on terrorist group strategies for using violence, and this discussion can be applied more broadly to violent resistance movements. Kidd and Walter noted 5 key strategies associated with the use of violence by terrorist groups, including an attrition strategy, an intimidation strategy, a provocation strategy, a spoiling strategy, and an outbidding strategy, with each representing a form of costly signaling that can be used to send signals to various audiences. Kidd and Walter defined costly signals as follows, quote, actions so costly that bluffers and liars are unwilling to take them. In international crises, mobilizing forces or drawing a very public line in the sand are examples of strategies that less resolved actors might find too costly to take. War itself, or the willingness to endure it, can serve as a forceful signal of resolve and provide believable information about power and capabilities. Costly signals separate the wheat from the chaff and allow honest communication, although sometimes at a terrible price. End quote. Costly signals communicate levels of resolve, power, and capabilities, and conflict itself can be a form of learning, as the pre-war period may be characterized by uncertainty and mistaken prior probabilities regarding these factors. Indeed, Jeffrey Blaney, in the 3rd edition of his book, The Causes of War, made the insightful observation that wars begin when states disagree about their relative power and end once they are in agreement. In the case of a conflict between a terrorist movement and a government, Balzer Overgaard, in an article titled The Scale of Terrorist Attacks as a Signal of Resources, noted that such conflicts are characterized by asymmetric information, where initially terrorists and resistance movements are aware of their own capabilities and resolve, but the government is not. Hence, a terrorist or insurgent movement may seek to undertake a large attack to signal its level of resources, to soften a potential government retaliation, and to also improve its bargaining position. More generally, resistance movements may believe they need to send costly signals to add credibility to their threats. As Kidd and Walter noted, quote, given the conflict of interests between terrorists and their targets, ordinary communication or cheap talk is insufficient to change minds or influence behavior. If al-Qaeda had informed the United States on September 10, 2001, that it would kill 3,000 Americans unless the United States withdrew from Saudi Arabia, the threat might have sparked concern, but it would not have had the same impact as the attacks that followed. Because it is hard for weak actors to make credible threats, terrorists are forced to display publicly just how far they are willing to go to obtain their desired results. End quote. Further, they noted, quote, to obtain their political goals, terrorists need to provide credible information to the audiences whose behavior they hope to influence. Terrorists play to two key audiences: governments whose policies they wish to influence, and individuals on the terrorists' own side, whose support or obedience they seek to gain. End quote. The same as well can be said for violent resistance movements more generally. As previously noted, the different strategies identified by Kidd and Walter represent different forms of costly signaling. Attrition Strategy. Within an attrition strategy, violence is used to signal strength and resolve and to convey that it is in the best interests of the incumbent government to yield to the demands of the resistance movement. The objective is to impose high costs on the target for its policies, thereby lending credibility to threats to inflict future costs. This was essentially the strategy of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong against the United States during the Vietnam War, and Kidd and Walter noted that other examples include the revolts against the British by the Greeks in Cyprus, the Jewish population in Palestine, and the Arabs in Aden during the end of the British Empire. As part of an attrition strategy, groups may also use violence and target selection to communicate resolve to potential supporters. Stephen Nemeth, in his PhD dissertation on a rationalist explanation of terrorist targeting, noted that attacks on civilians send a signal of resolve to a government by signaling a willingness to violate norms of warfare. At the same time, such attacks signal to potential recruits that the organization is committed to absorbing the costs and repercussions associated with attacks on civilians. Additionally, groups may use violence to signal resolve and capabilities without intending to secure concessions or gain a seat at the bargaining table in the short term. In the January 2015 exchange of attacks between Israel and Hezbollah, it appeared that both sides intended to communicate resolve and strength without actually precipitating a war. According to Jody Redoran and Ann Bernard in a New York Times article titled "Hezbollah Kills 2 Israeli Soldiers Near Lebanon," one analyst stated that, quote, it's a very delicate game because both sides want to respond hard enough that they're not perceived as weak, but not too hard to start a war, end quote. While a diplomat observed that, quote, to me, the whole thing was calibrated to say, you did your thing, we did our thing, end quote. Although violence is an inherent part of an attrition strategy, as well as other strategies, sometimes violent resistance movements and incumbent governments develop informal rules of the game to regulate its use, such as restrictions either on attacks on civilians or attacks in certain territories. In such cases, one side may feel that it needs to use violence if the other side crosses a red line by violating an informal restriction. For instance, in the previously mentioned fighting between Hezbollah and Israel, Hezbollah believed that Israel violated informal rules by attacking Hezbollah inside Syria. One official with extensive contacts with the group was quoted in Redoran and Bernard's New York Times article stating, quote, Israel crossed the red line, and if Hezbollah did not react, Israel will not stop. The attack shows that Hezbollah's confrontation is with Israel, so it can get back its respected position in the Arab world, end quote. This quote parallels the earlier point regarding signaling third parties, such as potential supporters. Intimidation Strategy. Violence can also be used as part of an intimidation strategy to coerce a population and undermine the legitimacy of the government by punishing those individuals who support or collaborate with the government and abide by its rules. As Kidd and Walter noted, an intimidation strategy, quote, works by demonstrating that the terrorists have the power to punish whoever disobeys them, and that the government is powerless to stop them. End quote. Daniel Byman, in his article, The Logic of Ethnic Terrorism, noted that attacks against a population can compel cooperation with the resistance movement even if the public does not support the goals of the group. At a minimum, he noted, a group needs to convince a population not to denounce it, which can be accomplished by making the population fear violence. Attacks launched against pro-government citizens or agents of the government, including mayors, police, prosecutors, or political officials, or against government services and economic institutions, are designed to discourage collaboration with the government and signal that attacks against a population cannot be prevented. Such attacks serve to drain legitimacy from an incumbent government and encourage individuals to seek alternative security arrangements with the resistance movement. Such was the strategy of the JVP in the late 1980s as it unleashed a wave of attacks against Sri Lankan political and economic institutions and against political figures in both the ruling and opposition parties. Violence used as part of an intimidation strategy may also be intended to achieve demographic or political goals. For instance, attacks against a population can be intended to intimidate a population to leave a region. Such migration can make a region more politically viable and can forestall the establishment of ethnic enclaves, which can potentially house fifth columnists and subversive groups. Additionally, the existence of ethnic enclaves can be used as an excuse by co-ethnics in surrounding territory to launch a war for their defense and liberation. For instance, ethnic transfer was clearly the goal of LTTE attacks on Muslims in northern Sri Lanka, to encourage Muslim emigration to other regions of the island and thus ensure the political viability of a separate Tamil region in northern Sri Lanka. Byman noted that population transfer was also the goal of the 1947 attack by the Irgun and Stern gang that killed 254 Arab inhabitants of the village of Deir Yassin. The attack was designed to frighten Palestinian Arabs from villages, thereby clearing territory for Jewish settlement. Menachem Begin, the founder of the Likud party in Israel and a former prime minister of the Jewish state, observed that, quote, the massacre was not only justified, but there would not have been a state of Israel without the victory at Deir Yassin. End quote. Ethnic cleansing was also widespread in Baghdad after the U.S. invasion and in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Such a strategy of intimidation is designed to win the census and establish facts on the ground before eventual peace talks, which may decide to set geographic boundaries based on the existing spatial distribution of different population groups once fighting has ended. Additionally, hardliners within a resistance movement may wage attacks against moderates who negotiate with an incumbent government. Such negotiations risk reaching a resolution short of the demands of hardliners, thereby calling into question previous sacrifices made with the intention of achieving maximalist goals, and even calling into question the existence of a hardline faction itself, because the latter may lose its raison d'etre in the aftermath of a compromise. This appears to have been the motivation of LTTE attacks against moderate Tamil politicians who negotiated with the Sri Lankan government in an effort to solve the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. For the LTTE, moderate politicians represented careerists and sellouts who threatened to cheapen the sacrifices made by insurgents in the effort to achieve an independent state, and these attacks were intended to discourage efforts at reaching a settlement with the government. Provocation Strategy. Insurgent groups may also adopt a provocation strategy, whereby the use of violence against an incumbent government is intended to draw an indiscriminate attack against the host population, thereby fostering radicalization. Under such a strategy, a violent resistance movement seeks to turn an incumbent government's force advantage against it. Speaking of terrorism, McCormick noted, quote, terrorists, as a general rule, begin the game with the ability to see their opponents, but a limited ability to attack what they see. The state, by contrast, begins the game with a much greater ability to attack what it sees, but a limited ability to see what it wishes to attack. Terrorist groups enjoy an information advantage. The state enjoys a force advantage. This simple asymmetry is a defining feature of any contest between a state and an underground competitor. A strategy of provocation is designed to take advantage of the underground's information advantage and turn the state's force advantage against it by provoking the regime to strike out indiscriminately at targets it cannot see. End quote. Additionally, as Kidd and Walter noted, in some cases, the leadership of a terrorist organization or violent resistance movement more generally is more hostile to an incumbent regime than is the general population. Thus, a provocation strategy by goading a government into an indiscriminate response is designed to convince a population that the target government is so irredeemably evil that it needs to be replaced or at least compelled into conceding concessions favorable to the group that used violence to encourage the disproportionate reaction. How does an indiscriminate response accomplish this? Ethan Bueno de Mesquita and Eric Dixon, in their article titled The Propaganda of the Deed, Terrorism, Counterterrorism, and Mobilization, noted that an incumbent government's counter-response to violence provides information to a host population regarding the government's type, which in this context pertains to whether or not a government is interested in the welfare of an aggrieved population that is host to a violent resistance movement. By generating high casualties and significant economic costs, not only among members of a violent resistance movement and its supporters, but also among the general population, the aggrieved population is likely to formulate an updated subjective probability on the nature of the target government, concluding that it is not interested in the population's welfare. Under such conditions, the population may assign a higher updated probability to future end states entailing widespread economic damage caused by a targeted government. Combined with moral repugnance at the government's apparent lack of concern about the safety and welfare of non-combatants, the population may then decide to flock toward the violent resistance movement. Before using violence to wage a provocation strategy, the leaders of a violent resistance movement are likely to formulate a subjective probability regarding the likelihood that a government will respond with a discriminate or indiscriminate campaign against the group. Within the context of the equivalent response model, a violent resistance movement may wage a provocation strategy if it believes that its use of violence will remain within the band of excellence, and if it assigns a high probability that the government will respond with a level of indiscriminate violence that exceeds the upper threshold of violence. Stathis Kalivas, in the book The Logic of Violence in Civil War, noted that a population's normative reaction to being targeted indiscriminately stems from individuals' anger at being attacked independently of what they did or could have done, which they perceive as deeply unfair. This perception makes a targeted population willing to support risky and violent actions in response. One Guatemalan peasant described this conversion of fear into anger amid indiscriminate violence. Quote, "This was so heavy. So heavy. You were disturbed. You wanted to have some way of defending yourself. The feeling emerged, it wasn't fear but anger. Why do they come persecuting if one is free of faults, if one works honorably? You felt bad. Well, we all did. Grief, but also anger." End quote. One way in which indiscriminate violence feeds anger, as Kalivas noted, is through the establishment of a distorted incentive structure in which compliance with the demands of an incumbent government against assisting a violent resistance movement may be as unsafe as non-compliance. Members of a violent resistance movement may be no more threatened by punishment than non-combatants, and under such conditions, the general populace may believe it probable that the government's desired end state is the annihilation of the targeted population. In addition, the populace may flock to a violent resistance movement if it offers the possibility of protection from such an indiscriminate government campaign. A resistance movement may anticipate this type of shift. As one Viet Cong document pointed out, quote, "The party was correct in its judgment that government doctrine would drive additional segments of the population into opposition, where they would have no alternative but to follow the party's leadership to obtain protection." End quote. Once a government engages in indiscriminate violence, a violent resistance movement can then engage in armed propaganda, developing a narrative that depicts the targeted government as insensitive to the needs of the population and therefore as an illegitimate governing entity. In some conflicts, history provides a ready-made ontology with components and relationships that populate a discourse. Such a history will provide a set of grievances replete with a collection of actors and interactions among them, and these may form the building blocks that constitute a narrative a group uses to mobilize a population. For example, the Shining Paths narrative emphasized the racism and economic and political marginalization that befell Peru's indigenous population after the arrival of the Spanish centuries before. By provoking indiscriminate government counterresponses to its violence, the group was able to update and refresh this narrative by emphasizing new themes related to the government's illegitimate uses of force, thereby shifting the emphasis from historical injustice and displacement to current actions taken by the government. Outbidding Strategy. Another strategy identified by Kidd and Walter is an outbidding strategy. A violent resistance movement may adopt this strategy if it appears that a host population may actually prefer the use of violence against a target government. An example is the Palestinian Society's preference for suicide bombings after the buildup of frustration with the Oslo peace process in 1999. Mia Bloom, in her article on Palestinian suicide bombing, observed that Palestinian support for suicide operations against Israelis was less than 30% between May 1997 and March 1999, and by the summer of 1999, support for Hamas had fallen to 10%. However, a combination of factors, including a decline in Palestinian faith that the peace process would deliver an independent state, the corruption exhibited by Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Authority, and the failure of the Palestinian Authority to improve the daily lives of most Palestinians, led to an increase in support for suicide operations. From December 2000 to October 2003, Palestinian support for suicide operations exceeded 60%, with support reaching 85% in September 2001. Within the context of the discussion in the prior section on rationality and violence, Palestinian support for suicide bombing suggests that Palestinians assigned a low subjective probability of achieving their desired end state of an independent Palestine through negotiations. Rather, as Mia Bloom noted, they began to view violence as their only option for achieving independence, and under such conditions, various Palestinian groups began to compete and outbid each other in the provision of violence to boost mobilization and increase their share of support among the Palestinian population. After a series of suicide bombings in 2000, support for Hamas increased to more than 70%, and during this period, various other groups, including the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and a new group, An-Natir, the Warning, began to use the language of holy war and to rely on suicide bombings, even to the point of claiming responsibility for attacks likely carried out by other groups. In this case, the Palestinian strategy was motivated by both outbidding and a desire to provoke Israel, and there is some empirical evidence suggesting that the radicalization of Palestinian opinion following Israeli attacks displayed noticeable temporal patterns and, in particular, decayed over time. Examining longitudinal data on Palestinian public opinion during the Second Intifada, David Yeager, along with his co-authors in their article The Struggle for Palestinian Hearts and Minds, Violence and Public Opinion in the Second Intifada, found that Palestinian fatalities caused by Israel lowered Palestinian support for negotiations and also for the more moderate Fatah faction, as opposed to Hamas, within 1 month of the fatality's occurrence, but this effect completely dissipated after 3 months. In a separate study, the authors found that increases in support for Hamas or Fatah as these groups pursued an outbidding strategy did not come at the expense of the other party. Specifically, Hamas's gain in support from its use of violence during the Second Intifada came at the expense of other Islamist groups, such as Palestinian Islamic Jihad, while the increase in support for Fatah after its use of violence came at the expense of support for secular groups, such as the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Additionally, the authors found that support for either Hamas or Fatah was unchanged when the other faction engaged in violence. These results seem to suggest that, at least in this example, when groups compete with each other while implementing an outbidding strategy, a populace may evaluate a particular group relative to those of a similar type. Spoiler Strategy. The final strategy identified by Kidd and Walter is the spoiler strategy. With this strategy, extremists within an opposition movement use violence to scuttle any attempts at improved relations between moderates on their side and the targeted government. As the authors observed, the use of violence by extremists exploits lingering uncertainty and mistrust between moderates and the government and is designed to convince the targeted government that moderates are not willing or able to stop violence against the government. Asymmetric information may also be a factor because a targeted government may not be able to observe the extent of actions taken by moderates to curtail violence by extremists and may therefore judge the sincerity of the moderates according to whether violence occurred. Kidd and Walter cited various examples of a spoiler strategy, including violence by Hamas during ratification and implementation of the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, violence before Israeli elections in 1996 and 2001, during which the more dovish Labour Party was in power, with violence intended to produce an Israeli preference for the more hawkish Likud Party, which was skeptical of the Oslo peace process, and the use of violence after Arafat's electoral victory in 1996. This electoral success cemented the idea that Arafat was a powerful leader within the Palestinian territories, and so the use of violence against Israelis was intended to signal that Arafat was able but unwilling to crack down on violence against Israelis and therefore could not be trusted as a peace partner. Although Kidd and Walter did not privilege it with its own category, the mobilization of a population factors highly in calculations of the use of violence by resistance movements. In particular, violence can be used to overcome what is known as the collective action problem. In the 1960s, Mancur Olson, in his book The Logic of Collective Action, Public Goods and the Theory of Groups, noted that it does not necessarily follow that rational, self-interested individuals will act in support of a collective good or common interest, even if doing so will better their situations. This will be the case if acting collectively in pursuit of a common interest is not individually rational, and this phenomenon came to be known as the collective action problem. Importantly, a collective action problem may lead to the suboptimal provision of public goods, especially as a group becomes larger, because individual members, believing that the collective good will be provided anyway by the efforts of other members of the group, have an incentive to shirk their responsibility to contribute toward the provision of the public good. Such a strategy of free riding may be individually rational because often the consumption of a public good is non-excludable and available to all, not just to those who took action and paid the costs for its provision. If many members of a group were to behave in this manner, such collective behavior may translate into the suboptimal provision and even non-provision of the collective good. How might the collective action problem help explain the mobilization challenges insurgent movements face? One can regard the desired outcome of an insurgency, such as a revolutionary socialist government, a territory under Sharia law, a liberal democracy allied with the West, or an ethnocratic enclave carved out of a multinational empire, as a public good requiring self-sacrifice among a relevant population. However, as Dr. McCormick and Frank Giordano, in their article on symbolic violence and guerrilla mobilization, noted, insurgency is an inherently risky business that in most cases offers little possibility of success. More specifically, in the initial stages of a rebellion, insurgent groups tend to be small and less powerful than the state they are fighting. Under such conditions, the collective action problem is often insurmountable, as most potential supporters correctly judge that the likelihood of success is remote, leaving only a small number of die-hard activists willing to risk their lives for a desired collective good. For this reason, most opposition groups die young. How do groups that go on to challenge the state for supremacy overcome this initial mobilization dilemma? One such strategy, as noted by McCormick and Giordano, is to wage violence against highly symbolic icons of state power. If successful, such attacks generate violent images that, whether factually correct or not, attest to the growing relative strength of the insurgents. The process by which this happens and the role of violence in effectuating this process is noted by the authors. Quote, "Violence is used as an instrument of armed propaganda. The objective is to advertise the existence of an emerging opposition, raise popular consciousness, and define the terms of the struggle. As Thomas Thornton has suggested, incumbents typically enter an insurgency in a natural state of political inertia, even in the absence of significant popular support. The insurgents, for their part, begin the game as outsiders, an alien political force which the organism of society will be predisposed to cast out. Before the opposition can even begin the process of building a base of popular support, it must first be able to disrupt the system's inertial stability. In order to do this, the insurgents must break the tie that binds the mass to the incumbents by removing the structural supports that give the system its strength. These actions, as Thornton goes on to explain, will gradually sever the socio-psychological bonds that tie conditional elements of the population to the state and force them to choose between a disintegrating status quo and an emerging opposition. This cannot be achieved with words. It can only be achieved with violence." End quote. If highly symbolic violent acts are repeatedly carried out, the populace may then be forced to choose between supporting what it perceives as a crumbling status quo and supporting an opposition that appears to be growing in strength. Under such conditions, the majority of the population may support the latter to partake in any spoils of victory and to avoid being on the receiving end of any score-settling violence that may result from having supported the losing side or not fully supported the winning side. Additionally, in the case of ethnic civil wars, the use of violence can promote mobilization along ethnic lines and even foster identity formation and maintenance. Indeed, Byman noted that violent resistance movements that are ethnically based and seek independence often face the task of forging a nation, that is, an imagined community of people who perceive some common connection on the basis of some shared characteristic, in addition to building an ethnocracy or an ethnically based state. He stated, quote, "The ethnic terrorist group begins the struggle by strengthening ethnic identity. In this effort, the terrorist often faces an uphill struggle. Region, tribe, sect, family, and state are all rival sources of identity for individuals. So the first task for the terrorist is to make ethnicity politically salient for the larger ethnic community." End quote. Even if unsuccessful, violence can draw attention to identity issues and highlight distinctions between ethnic groups, a process that is magnified when the state response also involves violence. Quote, "Even more beneficial to identity creation than terrorist violence, however, is the state response to violence. State repression creates identities and mobilizes individuals. The Sri Lankan government response to LTTE violence has given rise to the perception that the Sri Lankan state and army act only in the interest of the Sinhalese. Often, weak identities become politically salient when outsiders create an awareness of them. The Basque separatist group ETA made this goal explicit. It sought to force the government to lash out blindly and create a backlash that would increase popular support for the guerrillas. Similarly, the Irgun sought to conduct operations against the British that would compel British security forces to intern, interrogate, and otherwise harass the Jewish community as a whole." End quote. Such communally focused state repression can help activate and politicize latent identities, as noted by one Bosnian schoolteacher during the Yugoslav conflict in the mid-1990s. Quote, "We never, until the war, thought of ourselves as Muslims. We were Yugoslavs. But when we began to be murdered because we are Muslims, things changed. The determination of who we are today has been determined by our killers." End quote. This section highlighted the multifaceted motivation for the use of violence and its impact. We now turn to analyzing how resistance movements navigate the upper threshold of violence, in particular, how such groups can raise this threshold.